In the quiet farmlands of rural Montana, time does not move the way it should. Days repeat, nights vanish, families wake to lives they don't remember, and strangers who look exactly like them sit at their dinner tables. At first, it seemed like folklore. Barns reappearing after being burned, clocks spinning backward, children aging years overnight. But soon, entire towns began to shimmer, vanish, and return changed. And the government noticed. Soldiers sealed roads, towers rose on the hillsides, hazmat teams collected calendars and photographs as though time itself was contagious. But the valley wasn't broken. It was built this way. Ancient spirals carved into stone prove someone had been here before us. Someone who understood that time was not a straight line, but a wheel. And that wheel is still turning. This is not just Montana's mystery. It is spreading across the world, duplicate flights landing hours apart, newspapers from futures that haven't happened, scars opening in the night sky. The last reset has already begun. The question is not if time will bend again. The question is, how many times have we already lived this? The story begins the spring of 1997 in a quiet valley deep in rural Montana. Life here was as steady as the land itself. Families worked their cattle, fields stretched endlessly beneath the vast sky, and every day seemed to unfold in predictable rhythm. It was the kind of place where people trusted their clocks and their routines as much as they trusted their neighbours. But that year the rhythm faltered, and what started with one man's confusion would unravel into something that defied all reason. Richard Mallory, a farmer who had lived in the valley his entire life, was the first to speak up. One evening, after finishing his chores, he drove his old Chevy pickup along a familiar dirt road that led from his pasture to the main highway. It was a route he had taken hundreds of times, a short, uneventful drive. He remembered the golden light on the fields, the faint shape of the mountains on the horizon, and even the country song humming from the radio. For him, it felt like 20 minutes. But when he reached the paved road and checked the dashboard clock, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. It was 2 hours later than it should have been. At home, his wife confirmed what he feared. She had been pacing the porch, worried, convinced something had happened. "You've been gone for hours," she told him sharply. Richard protested. It had only been minutes, he swore, but the cold dinner on the table and the dimming light outside proved otherwise. Both his truck's clock and his wristwatch agreed. Time had slipped away without him noticing. At first, Richard kept quiet. In a small community, no one wanted to be the fool who couldn't tell time. But eventually, he shared his story at the local diner. He expected laughter, maybe a few jokes about losing track of the day. Instead, the opposite happened. The diner went quiet. People leaned closer, and one by one, others admitted they had noticed something too. A ranch hand described feeding horses at dawn, only to find the wall clock insisting it was nearly noon. A woman swore she saw the sun rise twice in a single morning, dipping low and then climbing back into the sky. Another driver admitted he had passed the same red barn 3 times on the same stretch of road, as if the world itself had folded back on him. Each account came with nervous laughter, but the laughter quickly faded when the similarities became clear. It wasn't just Richard. It wasn't just one bad clock or one tired mistake. Time in the valley was slipping, twisting, repeating, and what frightened people most was how normal it felt while it happened. No blackouts, no strange lights, just life continuing as usual, until they realized the hours no longer made sense. Skeptics offered explanations: exhaustion, stress, broken watches. But too many details lined up. Too many people recalled the same low humming sound in the air, the same vibration beneath their boots just before the lapses occurred. Radios replayed songs twice in a row. Dogs barked at nothing. The valley itself seemed to carry an invisible weight. Old stories surfaced. Whispers passed down through generations. Native legends spoke of the circle that eats days, a place where hunters could return before they had even left. Others remembered military experiments in the 1980s, radar tests that shook the ground and left rumors in their wake. Richard's missing hours, it seemed, weren't just an isolated mistake. They were the first sign of something the valley had been hiding for a long time. By the end of that year, Richard's story was no longer a local curiosity. It was the beginning of what residents would soon call the Montana time loop, a mystery that turned the ordinary passage of hours into something dangerous, elusive, and terrifyingly unstable. As word of Richard Mallory's strange missing hours spread, the valley's secret began to attract attention from beyond its quiet borders. Montana wasn't the kind of place that drew outsiders often, but once the story slipped into hushed conversations at bars and gas stations, it became fuel for curiosity seekers, paranormal enthusiasts, and even college students eager for something beyond textbooks. By late summer, strange cars appeared on back roads. Hikers trekked into the foothills with cameras and camcorders, convinced they would capture the impossible. Most of them returned with nothing but frostbite and tall tales, but a few carried stories that fueled the fire. A pair of hikers, trudging along a ridge at dusk, claimed they spotted hunters on the opposite slope. The hunters looked real enough, men in flannel coats carrying bolt-action rifles. But when the hikers waved, the men didn't respond. They seemed frozen, as if locked in some distant frame of time. By the time the hikers crossed the ravine and reached the slope, the hunters had vanished, leaving no tracks in the snow. Later, one of the hikers swore the rifles were decades out of date, the kind his grandfather had once used. Evidence came in stranger forms too. A farmer, weary of hearing his neighbours' rumours, set up an old camcorder on his porch one night to catch coyotes near his fields. When he played the tape the next morning, his stomach turned. The recording showed the stars overhead shifting unnaturally, jumping backward 4 minutes as if the sky itself had rewound. The camcorder's timestamp confirmed it. Skeptics argued it was a glitch in the tape, a simple malfunction, but believers saw proof. Time itself was folding in plain view. With outsiders arriving, the valley's residents grew uneasy. They didn't welcome strangers poking around their land, especially not ones with video cameras and notebooks asking endless questions. Some feared that attention would wake it up, that whatever was happening might worsen if it was disturbed. Others went silent altogether, refusing to talk, as if secrecy could protect them. Yet the evidence kept mounting. That autumn, a pair of college students camped near an abandoned logging road. In the early hours of the morning, they heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. They peeked out of their tent and saw headlights bouncing along the road, except the truck never passed. The sound of the engine kept looping, the headlights freezing, vanishing, then reappearing, as though the same 30 seconds were replaying endlessly. Terrified, the students abandoned their gear and hiked back to town at dawn. When they told their story, the locals shook their heads. They weren't the first to see the road fold in on itself. At the same time, whispers of government interest began to circulate. Ranchers noticed black SUVs parked on ridges, engines idling, men inside watching the valley through binoculars. At first, it was dismissed as paranoia, but soon hunters reported unmarked helicopters hovering low in the mist, their blades chopping the air late at night. The outsiders with notebooks weren't the only ones taking interest. Someone with more power was watching too. The sense of being observed unsettled the community more than the anomalies themselves. It wasn't just the valley that seemed unstable. It was the growing suspicion that someone knew exactly what was happening and wasn't saying a word. Between ghostly hunters on the ridges, camcorders that caught the sky stuttering, and unmarked vehicles watching from the hills, the valley was no longer a forgotten corner of Montana. It was a place where people came searching for answers and often left with more questions than they could bear. The quiet rhythm of farm life, once untouched, was now pierced by headlights on back roads and the sound of distant rotors cutting through the night. Whatever had begun with Richard Mallory's missing hours was no longer just a local mystery. It was becoming a phenomenon too big to hide. By the time autumn settled into the valley, the locals began to whisper about patterns that went back much further than Richard Mallory's lost hours. The older generations, men and women who had lived their entire lives on this land, began recalling strange events that no one had wanted to speak of until now. It wasn't the first time clocks had gone astray. It wasn't even the first time the land itself seemed to slip. The difference was that, in the past, the stories stayed buried under ridicule or silence. Now, with so many new incidents, the past came rushing forward. An elderly rancher named Howard Briggs remembered his father telling him about a morning in 1943 when an entire day vanished. His father had ridden out to mend a fence just after sunrise, but when he came home, his wife was weeping. The date on the kitchen calendar had flipped forward by a full day, and the neighbors swore he'd been missing for 36 hours. The man himself remembered nothing, just riding along a fence line while the world apparently leapt forward without him. Old newspaper clippings, pulled from dusty boxes in the library basement, hinted at similar tales. Reports of trains arriving at the wrong times in the 1920s. Entire crews insisting they had left Billings at noon, only to arrive in Livingston 2 hours before they departed. Editors chalked it up to poor bookkeeping or misread watches. But now, in light of what was happening, those mistakes read like warnings no one had wanted to believe. Teachers noticed it too. In October, Mrs. Keller, who taught the Valley's only middle school, stood before her 7th grade class and watched the hands of the clock on the wall freeze at exactly 10:13. For her, it was only a heartbeat. She blinked, then continued her lesson. But the children began whispering, swearing the same 2 minutes had repeated 3 times. Their notes were different. A boy's joke that had landed once came again, word for word, even though he swore he hadn't spoken. For them, time had replayed like a record skipping. That night, several of the children told their parents about something else. They said a man had been standing at the back of the classroom near the chalkboard. None of the adults had seen him. None of the other teachers reported a visitor. But the children were adamant. He had been tall, thin, with pale eyes, and he had smiled without moving his mouth. They called him the Time Man. No one knew if he was real or just their imagination weaving shadows into meaning. But the children, normally rowdy and dismissive, spoke of him with quiet fear. The folklore ran deeper still. A woman named Helen Green, who lived alone at the edge of the valley, brought out a leather-bound journal belonging to her grandfather. In his careful handwriting, dated 1891, he described seeing the sun rise twice in one morning and hunting deer in a forest that seemed to reset itself whenever he reloaded his rifle. "It is as if the woods do not want to let me leave," he wrote. "Every path leads back to the same clearing, and when I come home my wife insists I was gone far longer than I know." The more people shared, the clearer it became. The valley had a history of losing time, but each generation had been too cautious, too afraid of ridicule, to speak openly. Now, the veil of silence was gone, and the weight of those forgotten accounts pressed heavily on the present. By late October, the valley no longer felt like a place where a mystery had just begun. It felt like a place where a long-forgotten cycle had resurfaced, forcing everyone to acknowledge what their ancestors had already known. This land did not obey the rules of time. Until now, the strange events in the valley had seemed like scattered accidents. A lost hour here, a broken watch there, stories told in hushed voices at the diner or over fences between neighbors. But in early November, something shifted. For the first time, whole groups of people experienced the loops together. There was no denying it anymore. Time wasn't just misbehaving in private, it was slipping in front of everyone. It began in the church. On a crisp Sunday morning, the pews were full, the organ swelled, and Reverend McAllister delivered a sermon on patience. The congregation listened, heads bowed, while sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. But halfway through, a few people frowned. They had heard these words before, not weeks ago, not even earlier that year, but just minutes earlier. The Reverend's voice, his hand gestures, even the dust drifting in the beams of light, it all unfolded exactly the same. Some dismissed it as déjà vu, but then it happened again. The Reverend turned the same page twice, and the choir repeated the same hymn without realizing. By the third time, the silence in the pews grew heavy, and frightened glances darted across the room. They weren't imagining it. The sermon was looping. That afternoon, the valley's only school bus ran late. Parents waiting along the dirt road grew restless as the bus failed to appear. Then, almost an hour behind schedule, the familiar yellow bus pulled into sight, children waving from its windows. But something was wrong. Several parents swore they had seen that very bus pass the same road 30 minutes earlier, at the exact same angle, with the exact same children waving in the exact same way. Even the dog sitting on one family's porch barked twice in confusion, as though it too sensed the repetition. By the time the bus rolled to a stop and the children poured out, no one could say with certainty how many times it had arrived. The strangest event happened by the riverbank during a Sunday picnic. Dozens of families gathered, grilling food, tossing baseballs, and enjoying the crisp air. At first, everything was normal, until people began to notice gaps. A tossed ball froze in mid-air for a breath too long, then dropped with a jarring thud. Smoke from the grills twisted into patterns that seemed to reverse and unwind, curling back into the coals instead of dispersing. Conversation stopped and restarted in mismatched rhythm, as though the words themselves had doubled back. Then came the ripple. It was invisible at first, a faint vibration under the earth, then a shimmer that passed across the riverbank like heat haze. Wherever it touched, time rewound by several minutes. A burger flipped on the grill landed raw again, still uncooked. A child fell, scraped her knee, then stood uninjured as if the accident had been erased. Parents shouted in panic, trying to hold on to children who seemed to move twice in the same instant. For those caught in the ripple, it was like living inside an echo. When it passed, the picnic carried on in silence, no one daring to move as if any motion might trigger another loop. Some families left immediately, abandoning food and folding chairs, desperate to escape whatever had just happened. Others stood rooted in place, staring at the ground or sky, convinced that the world might fold in on itself at any moment. In the days that followed, no one could explain the loops away as stress or coincidence. Too many had witnessed them. Too many had lived inside them. The entire community now shared the same terror. Time was no longer just misaligned. It was breaking in front of their eyes, and it was taking everyone with it. By winter, the valley had grown accustomed to loops and lost hours. People lived with unease, checking their clocks twice, glancing at the sun suspiciously, wondering whether the day was unfolding for the first time or the second. But something new began to happen, something far more disturbing. The valley was no longer just replaying itself, it was creating copies. The first report came from the Peterson family who lived on the north side of town. One evening, as snow dusted the windows, Mrs. Peterson set the table for supper. Her husband came in from the barn, shaking off the cold. They sat down to eat when she heard the front door open again. Turning her head, she froze. Her husband, coat still frosted from outside, was stepping into the room. For a moment, both versions of him stood there, one seated at the table with a fork in hand, and one still unwinding his scarf. She dropped the plate she was holding, and the sound of shattering china seemed to snap the moment apart. The seated husband blinked, looked around in terror, and vanished. The one at the door simply asked why she was screaming. Not long after, a ranch hand named Mark was out mending a fence when he saw someone walking toward him across the snow. The figure wore his same jacket, the same hat, even carried the same roll of wire. As the two men drew closer, Mark felt as if he was staring into a warped mirror. His double tilted his head, opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. Instead, the air buzzed, and when Mark stumbled backward, the figure flickered like static and dissolved, leaving him gasping in the cold air. It didn't stop with individual encounters. Families began to notice extras appearing in their homes. A teenage girl screamed when she found another child sitting on her bed, an identical version of her younger brother, silently staring with blank eyes. The duplicate vanished when the real boy walked into the room, leaving only the sheets disturbed where he had been sitting. Another family reported hearing the back door open late at night. When they rushed to check, they found themselves, two versions of husband, wife, and child, standing on the porch, pale and unmoving, as if waiting to be let inside. At first, people convinced themselves these were hallucinations brought on by stress, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Sometimes the duplicates left faint traces, footprints in fresh snow, objects moved, even photographs where two identical figures appeared in the same frame. The most unsettling part was that they never acted violently. They didn't attack, didn't threaten. They simply appeared, watching, waiting, existing where they shouldn't. Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed the loops were overlapping, colliding realities spilling into one another. Others whispered that the time man the children had spoken of was multiplying, testing the edges of human existence. A few dared to wonder if these doubles weren't intruders at all, but shadows of themselves, versions caught in another cycle, bleeding through. The valley had grown used to time's tricks, but this was different. It wasn't just hours slipping or sermons repeating, it was identity itself coming undone. And in the silence of long winter nights, as families barred their doors and prayed not to hear footsteps in the snow, the fear that gripped them was not of time loops. It was the fear that when the door opened, the person who stepped inside might not belong to this world at all. By late winter, the valley had grown weary of itself. Families slept in shifts, afraid of what might appear at night. Children whispered of doubles that stood outside their windows. Men carried rifles to barns, not to fend off wolves, but to guard against strangers who looked like kin. Yet there was another presence in the valley now, something that didn't belong to the loops at all. People began noticing men on the ridgelines. They were always distant, just far enough away that their faces couldn't be seen. At first they were mistaken for hunters, their silhouettes sharp against the snowy slopes. But the longer people watched, the more wrong they seemed. They never moved like hunters. They didn't scan the hills for game or speak to each other. They just stood there, still, patient and unnervingly attentive. One morning, a rancher named Cole Jansen rode out to check his cattle. From the saddle, he spotted two figures on the rise above his property. They were dressed in plain coats, not camouflage, not uniforms. Each held something long and narrow, not quite binoculars, not quite rifles. Cole raised his hand to wave, but neither man reacted. They only stood, staring down at him, unmoving. When Cole rode closer, determined to confront them, the air shimmered faintly, and both figures vanished as if they had never been there at all. Other stories followed. A family driving home after dusk noticed headlights following them on the dirt road, but when they pulled over to let the vehicle pass, the lights went out instantly. Behind them, the road was empty, stretching silent under the moon. The most unsettling accounts came from those who managed to hear the watchers speak. A teenager claimed that while walking home, one of the men stepped from the tree line and asked him what year it was. Not in a joking way, not in confusion, but with clinical precision, like a scientist checking data. Another witness, a widowed woman, said a man knocked on her door and politely asked for the date. She answered out of habit, and when she looked back up, the man was gone, leaving only footprints that ended abruptly in the snow. By now, locals were convinced these weren't ordinary government men. Rumours spread that the watchers weren't even human, not in the way people understood. Some thought they were projections from the loops themselves, pieces of another reality overlapping into this one. Others whispered darker theories, that these men were scouts from another cycle, versions of humanity that had slipped into the valley ahead of time. What united all the sightings was the silence. The watchers didn't interfere, didn't engage. They simply observed, recording, cataloguing, sometimes asking the simplest questions as if testing whether the people of the valley were aligned with the same world. For many residents, the presence of the watchers was worse than the loops themselves. A repeating sermon or a duplicated neighbour could at least be explained as part of the valley's sickness. But the watchers, they suggested intention. Someone or something was monitoring the breakdown of time, and the valley was no longer just a place of accidents. It was a place under surveillance, and while people once feared what the loops would take from them, now they feared what the watchers were waiting for. By early spring, the valley was no longer just a place of whispers and rumours. Whatever had once been dismissed as folklore or hysteria was now under official watch. The outsiders in SUVs and helicopters were replaced with something much harder to ignore. Roads were blocked, checkpoints appeared overnight. The valley had become a perimeter, and its people found themselves living inside what felt like an experiment. It began with fences, steel posts driven into frozen ground, coiled razor wire unspooling across open fields, blocking familiar roads and cattle trails. Ranchers woke to find military trucks parked at crossroads, their drivers silent behind mirrored sunglasses. When questioned, they said little. Routine training exercises, they claimed, but the camouflage tents and satellite dishes rising in empty meadows told another story. Then came the antennas. Tall, skeletal towers sprouted from ridges, humming faintly in the wind. They weren't for radio, at least not the kind the locals knew. Hunters said the air around them felt charged, their compasses spinning without direction. Children complained of headaches when they passed too close. Some nights, residents swore they could hear the towers themselves, low, vibrating tones that seemed to crawl beneath the skin. And then, the hazmat teams arrived. They didn't knock. They rolled through town in unmarked vans, stepping out in sealed white suits, carrying crates and strange containers. One family swore they saw men removing their calendars, tearing pages from the walls, and sealing them in metal boxes. Another claimed their entire VHS collection, decades of family tapes, was confiscated without explanation. Contaminated dates, one suited figure muttered when pressed. It was as if time itself had become hazardous material. The valley responded with defiance. Men gathered in barns, rifles stacked by the door, debating whether to resist. But resistance never came. The soldiers didn't threaten directly. They simply waited, watched, and made it clear that no one could leave without permission. Some who tried found themselves turned back at roadblocks. Others never came back at all. The most terrifying moments were the sudden collapses, when whole stretches of time vanished in front of entire groups. A family remembered sitting down to breakfast, but in the next blink, they were standing in the barn at dusk, their plates of food untouched behind them. A farmer swore he watched his cornfields grow 3 weeks in the span of a single day, only to wither and rot by nightfall. In one chilling case, a child aged an entire year overnight, her clothes no longer fitting, her face suddenly older, while her parents screamed in disbelief. The soldiers were always nearby when these incidents occurred. They didn't intervene, didn't comfort, didn't even explain. They simply observed, clipboards in hand, recording what happened like scientists studying a specimen. The people of the valley realized then what had become of their home. They weren't citizens anymore, they were data. Some said the valley had become a laboratory. Others whispered it had become a cage. Either way, the message was clear. The loops were no longer just a mystery to be endured. They were being measured, tracked, and perhaps even controlled. The question no one dared to ask aloud was whether the military had come to contain the anomaly or to harness it. By summer, the valley no longer looked like itself. Roads that once connected towns suddenly bent back on themselves, leading travelers in circles. Maps once reliable became useless. Hunters who carried GPS units found them spinning between coordinates, as if the earth beneath them could no longer decide where it was. The land had splintered, and no one could agree on what was real. The first sign came from the county surveyor. Sent out to update property lines, he drove to a familiar bend in the road, only to find the road didn't bend anymore. Instead, it split. One direction led to the town of Deerfield, the other to a place he'd never seen before. A town with the same name painted on its welcome sign, but with different streets and buildings. Confused, he returned to the office with 2 maps, one old, one new, both claiming to show the same place. Soon, other residents began to notice the duplications. A rancher riding fence found his own property twice. 2 barns, both weathered and leaning, both filled with his cattle, yet subtly different. The hay bales stacked differently, the fence posts uneven where they had once been straight. When he tried to lead his herd back toward the homestead, half the cattle refused, as though they belonged to the other barn. The more people searched, the stranger it became. Gas stations appeared overnight on crossroads where nothing had stood the day before. Mailboxes duplicated themselves, one filled with bills from last week, the other with envelopes stamped with dates that hadn't arrived yet. Some families returned home to find their houses standing in the wrong place, shifted 20 feet to the left, foundations askew, yet still filled with all their belongings. Maps became useless. Drivers swore that highways folded back on themselves, sending them in loops that ended where they began, no matter which direction they chose. GPS units showed multiple copies of the same town layered on top of one another, flickering between coordinates. One student at the university in Billings tried to plot the valley on a digital map, only to find 3 versions of the same road twisting across his screen like overlapping handwriting. For those living inside the splintered geography, the disorientation was unbearable. Families would drive to a grocery store in town, only to return and find their house replaced with a different version of itself, familiar but altered. A neighbour's porch on the wrong side, a window missing, paint a colour they had never chosen. Some houses appeared abandoned, even though families swore they had left them filled with life only hours earlier. The government, of course, said nothing. The fences tightened, the antennas hummed louder, and the valley felt more like a fractured mirror than a place. Locals began pinning hand-drawn maps to diner walls, scribbled with notes. "This road disappears after sundown," or "Barn shows up twice. Avoid." Survival now meant remembering not only where you lived, but which version of your land still belonged to you. And yet, even with the fear, there was a growing suspicion among some that this splintering wasn't just collapse, it was structure, like pieces of glass arranged deliberately, overlapping to form a pattern too large for anyone to see. The valley wasn't breaking randomly, it was becoming something else. By midsummer, it was no longer just roads or barns that split in two. Whole towns began to shimmer and fracture, as if the valley's sickness had grown too large to contain itself within fences and fields. The loops were no longer just moments repeating. They were entire places dividing, overlapping, and tearing through one another. The first reports came from travellers. A truck driver swore he passed through the town of Deerfield twice in one day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. But the second Deerfield wasn't the same. The storefronts were arranged differently. The bank sat where the post office should have been, and people stared at him like he didn't belong. He bought coffee at the diner, but when he reached for his wallet, the bills inside were the wrong colour. Later, when he retraced his route, the second Deerfield was gone, swallowed back into the plain. Not long after, townsfolk themselves began to notice strange displacements. In the heart of the valley, Main Street would sometimes ripple like heat haze, and when the air settled, buildings were wrong. The hardware store's sign would display letters in an alphabet no one could read. The pharmacy's windows reflected faces that weren't the customers inside, but strangers with blank expressions. Locals swore they could walk down one side of the street and return to find the other side entirely changed. New facades, strange vehicles, people dressed just slightly out of step with the times. One chilling night, the town of Pine Ridge vanished altogether. From the hills, witnesses saw its streetlights blink out one by one, as if swallowed by shadow. By dawn, the town reappeared, but different, older, as though it had slipped backward in time. The gas pumps were gone, the streets unpaved, and wooden wagons stood in place of cars. For a full day, residents lived in this echo of another century before everything flickered again and returned to normal. Except not everything was normal. A few families never came back. Their houses remained dark, their belongings intact, but the people were gone. Then came the phasing. Entire buildings would flicker in and out like bad reception, solid one moment, transparent the next. Some residents claimed they could see alternate versions of themselves moving inside these ghostly structures, going about lives slightly different. A woman saw herself standing at a stove that no longer existed, stirring a pot in a kitchen that had collapsed years earlier. A man walked into his garage to find another version of himself working at a bench, who looked up in equal terror before both realities snapped apart. Children were the first to stop speaking of it casually. They refused to walk alone, terrified of slipping into the wrong town, the wrong house, or the wrong version of their own families. Teachers reported half their classrooms empty some mornings, only for the missing children to reappear hours later, bewildered, insisting they'd been in school the whole time. The valley was no longer just broken, it was multiplying. Communities overlapped, layered like sheets of tracing paper, each one faintly visible, each one threatening to bleed through. And as people stood in their kitchens, their shops, or on sidewalks that no longer stayed where they should, one fear grew louder than the rest. If towns could duplicate, then so could people. Which version of themselves truly belonged? And what would happen when the copies decided they didn't want to flicker away anymore? By late summer, the valley's strange distortions were no longer limited to land or people. The skies above Montana began to betray the same fractures, and those who worked in the air, pilots, radio operators, travelers, were among the first to notice. The atmosphere itself was looping, echoing, and speaking back in ways that no one could explain. It began with the pilots. Crop dusters flying over the wheat fields reported their instruments failing mid-air, altimeters spinning backward, fuel gauges dropping to empty, and then snapping back to full. One pilot swore he circled the same barn 4 times, though his compass insisted he was flying straight. Another reported something more chilling. As he came in for a landing, he saw his own plane already parked on the tarmac, canopy open, propeller still spinning. When he touched down, the other plane vanished like a mirage. Air travelers passing over Montana began filing complaints of turbulence that came from nowhere. Passengers reported seeing a second moon hovering near the horizon through cabin windows. One stewardess broke down after claiming that the captain's voice gave the safety briefing twice, once live and once in perfect echo seconds before he spoke. But the worst signs came over the radios. Ham operators, long used to late-night chatter across state lines, began recording impossible signals. Messages they hadn't sent yet played back to them. Entire conversations repeated with different voices answering before the question was asked. A trucker in Livingston swore he heard himself giving directions to a stranger's voice. Directions he would only speak 3 minutes later when another driver hailed him. The radios weren't just repeating sound, they were pulling transmissions forward, dragging voices out of the future. In one particularly unsettling incident, the local AM station glitched during its morning broadcast. For 6 minutes, the announcer's cheerful weather report overlapped with his own voice reading obituaries for people who were still alive. Listeners called the station in panic. Hours later, several of those names appeared in the hospital registry after an unexplained fire tore through a nearby barn. At night, the sky itself seemed to carry echoes. Residents swore they heard engines above them where no planes flew, contrails that dissolved and reformed as if tracing paths across multiple skies at once. On one September evening, dozens of witnesses claimed to see lights crossing the valley that split in 2 mid-flight, one set banking north, the other continuing east, both glowing against the stars until they blinked out together. The government's presence only deepened during these events. Mobile towers rolled into fields, vans with rotating dishes parked along highways, men in headsets listening intently to static. They never explained, never reassured, but residents began to suspect that they weren't recording new signals. They were listening for instructions, waiting for something that hadn't happened yet but would soon. The fear grew sharper, not because people didn't understand what was happening, but because they did. Time wasn't only looping inside kitchens and barns. It wasn't only splintering houses and towns. It had begun to speak, to broadcast, to echo across the air itself. And for those listening closely, the most terrifying thought was not that the valley was a broken place, but that it was sending a message outward. The question was who or what was supposed to hear it. By autumn, the strange events no longer belonged to a single valley. The fences, towers, and checkpoints might have kept people out, but they could not keep time itself contained. The sickness spread outward, first subtly, then with terrifying force until neighboring towns began to notice that the world no longer held steady. In Livingston, clocks in the courthouse froze for an entire afternoon. Judges, clerks, and defendants sat in silence as the hands refused to move. Outside, the sun shifted normally, shadows crawling across the streets, but inside the courthouse, time stood still. When the clocks finally ticked forward again, 4 hours had passed outside, though those inside swore they had only waited minutes. In Bozeman, farmers found their herds doubled, entire fields filled with cattle. 2 identical sets, each group marked with the same brands, each containing the same animals. For a moment, ranchers thought they had stumbled into a miracle of abundance, but then the herds began to wander into one another, dissolving like smoke when they touched, leaving nothing but confusion and dust. Billings experienced something stranger still. At the edge of town, a gas station reappeared that locals hadn't seen in years. Its faded sign advertised prices from decades ago, and its pumps were the old mechanical kind. But the building was wrong in subtle ways. The signage bore characters that weren't letters, symbols no one recognized. Drivers who stopped to investigate swore the pumps functioned, but the fuel they dispensed was cold as ice and evaporated before reaching the tank. By morning, the station vanished again, leaving only gravel where it had stood. And then there was the sky. It began as a faint streak, a scar that stretched from horizon to horizon, like a seam splitting open above Montana. At first, people thought it was a jet contrail, but it did not fade. It grew, pulsing faintly with light, splitting at dusk into two parallel streaks like mirrored scars. Some swore they saw stars misalign around it, constellations repeating themselves on either side of the divide. On one clear night, residents across 3 counties claimed to see 2 suns briefly shining in the scar, one rising, one setting, before both collapsed back into the sky. The presence of these events beyond the valley shattered the illusion of containment. Rumors spread faster than officials could suppress them. Small towns whispered of vanished days, duplicated buildings, phantom cars driving streets that no longer existed. Truckers passing through I-90 swore the same mile repeated 3 times, signs and landmarks looping until they broke free hours later. By now, no one could deny it. Whatever had begun in the valley was moving outward. The fences and military convoys meant nothing when the very fabric of time bled into the world beyond. Montana itself seemed to be infected, and if the scars in the sky were any sign, the infection was no longer confined to the earth. For the first time, fear reached beyond the locals. Pilots diverted flights. Newspapers in other states carried reports of anomalies. The valley was no longer an isolated mystery. It was becoming a contagion, and the question was no longer if it could spread. It was how far and how fast. By the following winter, it was no longer possible to speak of the Montana anomaly as if it belonged to a single valley or even a single state. What had once been confined to barns, classrooms, and back roads was now unfolding on a global stage. The world itself was beginning to loop. The first undeniable sign came from aviation. Commercial jets vanished from radar mid-flight, only to reappear minutes or hours later, thousands of miles away. In one widely reported case, a flight from New York to London landed twice, once in Heathrow, on schedule, and then again 3 hours later, the same passengers disembarking in shock, swearing they had never touched down before. Airport officials locked both groups inside the terminal, unable to explain how 2 identical flights could exist. On the oceans, shipping lanes became haunted. Crews reported ghostly ships drifting on the horizon, vessels decades out of date, some flying flags of nations that no longer existed. When approached, these ships dissolved into haze or repeated the same maneuvers endlessly, circling as though trapped inside their own loops. Fishermen in Alaska swore they passed the same lighthouse 3 times in a single day, though their maps insisted it was impossible. Time zones themselves began to falter. People in Tokyo reported clocks running hours ahead, while families in South America claimed they were living days behind. Entire cities rang in the new year twice. In some places, calendars split. 2 newspapers printed on the same morning carried different dates, each swearing to be correct. Business collapsed as time no longer held steady. Meetings missed, markets desynchronized, communication breaking down under the weight of inconsistency. For ordinary people, the effects were terrifyingly personal. A mother in Paris tucked her son into bed, only to find him eating breakfast downstairs seconds later. A man in Moscow answered a phone call from his wife before the phone rang. In Mexico City, thousands of residents swore the sun set in the east one evening, plunging the city into chaos. Each story spread across the globe, stitching together a picture that could not be denied. And then came the leaks. For years, whispers had circulated about antennas, fences, and hidden installations in Montana. But now documents began surfacing online, smuggled out by anonymous insiders. They spoke of something called the Temporal Harness Array, a sprawling system of towers and underground chambers built not to contain the loops but to exploit them. The array was described as a temporal stabilizer, but the notes suggested its purpose was far darker: to pull fragments of time into alignment, to seize control of repeating cycles and bend them into useful tools. One leaked video, said to come from inside the installation, showed technicians in a vast underground chamber surrounded by glowing panels. Behind them, a shimmering ripple spread across the walls, as if a piece of another day was being projected into the room. Voices overlapped, technicians moved twice in the same second, and alarms blared before the footage cut to static. It was proof not just of observation, but of interference. The world reacted with fury, disbelief, and panic. Some insisted the US government had broken time itself. Others argued it had merely discovered a natural fracture and was racing to control it before it consumed everything. But in the streets of cities across the world, one truth was clear. The loops were no longer local anomalies. They were global contagion, and the very systems designed to regulate life, airlines, markets, calendars, clocks, were unraveling. Time had always been the one thing people could rely on. Now, even that had been stolen. As the loops spread across the world, investigators, historians, and ordinary citizens began finding something even more unsettling than doubled planes or fractured skies. Hidden in dusty archives, government offices, and private collections were records that should not have existed. Files, photographs, and letters from timelines that no one remembered living through. The documents became known as the archive that shouldn't exist. The first discovery came from a clerk in Helena, Montana. While reviewing state records, she came across a set of memos stamped 1985, referencing Project Reclamation Phase 3. The memos described the valley being fenced off and evacuated due to temporal contamination. But when she searched deeper, there was no record of any such project, no history of mass evacuations, no acknowledgement that Phase 1 or Phase 2 had ever taken place. The memos carried official seals, signatures, and typewritten authenticity, but they documented an event that no one remembered. Soon, similar documents surfaced in other states. A box of declassified Cold War files contained references to US presidents who had never held office, meetings with foreign leaders who never existed, treaties signed between nations that had never been on any map. Historians stared in disbelief at reports that carried the same paper stock, the same formatting, the same bureaucratic language as real documents. The only difference was that the world those reports described was not this one. Photographs added to the confusion. Families cleaning attics uncovered Polaroids that showed impossible scenes. A child posing with parents in front of a house that had burned down years earlier. A couple on vacation in a city that didn't exist on any map. Men in uniforms with badges from organizations no one had ever heard of. In one particularly chilling find, a set of photographs taken in the 1960s showed a crowd gathered in front of a building that hadn't been constructed until 1993. The faces in the crowd were detailed and real, their eyes reflecting the flash of the camera, but they were frozen in a moment decades before it should have been possible. The press seized on these discoveries. Entire segments of late-night news were devoted to showcasing impossible archives. One reporter in Chicago displayed a newspaper from 1972 with headlines describing a lunar colony, complete with photographs of astronauts walking through a glass-domed settlement. Experts examined the paper's ink, fiber, and composition. Everything checked out as authentic, yet no lunar colony had ever been built. Theories spread. Some claimed these were deliberate forgeries planted to confuse or destabilize the public. Others argued they were leaks from overlapping timelines, worlds that had briefly intersected with ours, leaving behind scraps of their existence. A few suggested something darker, that governments had known about the fractures for decades, quietly filing away anomalies into hidden archives until the evidence became too overwhelming to contain. What made the archive most disturbing wasn't just its existence, it was its accuracy. Some documents described disasters or events before they happened, only for those events to unfold days or weeks later with eerie precision. A memo describing a barn fire resulting in 3 fatalities appeared in state files the day before such a fire actually occurred in the valley. A newspaper obituary surfaced naming a man who was still alive, until he died suddenly 2 days later in an accident that matched the article exactly. The past was no longer fixed. The future no longer waited. The archive seemed to prove that time itself was bleeding in both directions, scattering fragments into our world like torn pages from a book. Each new discovery pushed the same dreadful question into the minds of anyone who saw it. If the archive held evidence of events that never happened here, then which version of history were we actually living? While governments scrambled to explain or exploit the loops, others turned their eyes not to the future, but to the past. Historians, archaeologists, and tribal elders began comparing notes, and what they uncovered was more unsettling than leaked memos or duplicate towns. The valley was not simply a place where time had broken. It might have been built that way. Long before ranchers fenced the fields or the government erected towers, the Crow people told stories of a place they called the Circle that eats days. According to oral tradition, hunters who wandered too far sometimes returned before they had even left, carrying animals that hadn't yet been born or speaking of fires that had not yet burned. Elders said the land itself breathed in time like air, swallowing it and releasing it again. Most dismissed these as metaphors, warnings not to trespass on sacred ground. But as the modern loops grew undeniable, these stories took on new meaning. Archaeologists combing through the foothills began finding physical evidence, spirals carved into stone, arranged in repeating patterns, some large enough to stretch across entire ridgelines. The spirals weren't decorative, they were precise, measured to align with solstices and eclipses. Satellite imagery revealed that when connected, they formed vast circles invisible from the ground, patterns too deliberate to be coincidence. One discovery in particular shook the scientific community. Beneath a collapsed cave near the Yellowstone River, researchers uncovered chambers carved with interlocking symbols. Unlike anything in known indigenous art, these marks resembled mathematical diagrams, arcs, loops, and mirrored geometries that bore uncanny resemblance to modern models of temporal physics. Carbon dating placed the carvings at over 10,000 years old, far older than any established culture in the region. Whoever had carved them had understood cycles of time in a way no modern scientist could fully grasp. Some whispered that the valley wasn't malfunctioning at all. It was a machine, a mechanism designed to turn time in deliberate cycles, like gears grinding unseen beneath the earth. If so, then the modern loops weren't accidents, they were activations. Theories multiplied. Some believed the valley was a natural anomaly, harnessed by an ancient people who recognized its power. Others argued it was artificial from the start, constructed by a civilization erased from history. A few, more radical, suggested it wasn't human at all, that the loops were the fingerprints of something non-human shaping the planet long before humanity arrived. As more spirals and carvings were unearthed, residents of the valley found themselves staring at stones older than civilization, marked with the same patterns now humming from government towers. The resemblance was undeniable. Whatever the military had built was not original. It was mimicry, an attempt to replicate a design already etched into the land itself. For those who lived among the ruins, this realization was more terrifying than the loops themselves. If the valley was a machine, then who or what had built it? And if the loops were part of its function, then what exactly was it designed to do? The elders of the Crow gave one final warning. The circle does not break, one said, it waits, and when it turns, it takes everything with it. The loops had grown longer, more violent, and more unpredictable. Days vanished in minutes, years bled into hours, and towns blinked in and out of existence as if they were pawns being moved on a board. But all of these distortions pointed towards something greater, an ending, or perhaps a beginning. People began to speak of it in hushed tones as the last reset. The first signs came as silence. Radios that had carried endless echoes fell quiet. The scar in the sky, which had split and pulsed for months, widened into a gash, then stopped moving altogether. Clocks everywhere froze, not for minutes, but for entire days. The world felt suspended, as though holding its breath before something irreversible. Then the resets began. Unlike the flickers and glitches of earlier years, these were total. Families would wake to find themselves decades earlier, standing in kitchens where children had not yet been born, parents alive again, furniture unchanged. Others found themselves decades ahead, holding unfamiliar devices, their bodies older, their reflections altered in mirrors. People weren't just repeating moments anymore, they were being thrown wholesale into different timelines. One farmer swore he spent a week living in 1949, tending horses instead of tractors, only to blink and return to the present with mud still on his boots. A teacher awoke in a version of her hometown where she had never married, where her own children did not exist. She returned to find her students staring at her blankly as if she were a stranger. Whole towns shared these shifts. Billings reported vanishing for 72 hours, only to reappear changed. New buildings where none had stood, roads leading to places no map had ever marked. The fear escalated when duplicates began appearing. Survivors told of walking into their homes only to find another version of themselves already there, and living slightly different lives. Some coexisted uneasily, trying to share space with their doubles. Others ended in violence, with one version desperate to erase the other. At the same time, the valley's spirals began to glow faintly, visible even in daylight. From the hills, witnesses swore the entire land was turning, not metaphorically, but literally. The ground trembled, the ridgelines shifting like gears grinding in an unseen engine. The valley was no longer breaking down. It was winding up, gathering force like a mechanism, preparing to turn. The final collapse came without warning. Across the world, night and day lost meaning as the sun flickered, rising and setting dozens of times in a single hour. Cities fell silent as power grids failed under the strain of repeating surges. Airplanes disappeared mid-flight, sometimes landing before they had taken off. People awoke to lives that weren't theirs. Children calling them parents when they had never had families, wedding rings on fingers they swore had been bare. And then came the stillness. The scar in the sky sealed, leaving only a faint line of stars doubled across the horizon. The spirals stopped glowing. For the first time in years, there were no loops, no echoes, no resets. Survivors awoke to find the world quiet. But the silence was not relief, it was dread. Because everything was different now. Towns were rearranged, maps rewritten, histories altered. Families were together again, but not always the same families they remembered, and every survivor carried the same unspoken fear. This was not an end, it was a reset. And resets, by their nature, do not last forever. When the world awoke after the last reset, it was not to celebration but to disorientation. Everything was familiar, yet everything was wrong. Streets led to places that hadn't existed before. Families gathered at dinner tables with loved ones they remembered, and strangers they didn't. Photographs hung on walls showing moments no one recalled living, yet the faces were undeniably theirs. The government said nothing. The checkpoints vanished, the soldiers withdrawn, as if their purpose had ended. The towers remained, skeletal and silent, humming no more. But residents whispered that at night, if you pressed your ear to the steel, you could hear faint ticking like gears winding beneath the earth. The array might have gone quiet, but the valley itself was not done. In some towns, history itself seemed rewritten. Memorial statues bore new names, dates of birth and death rearranged. Libraries held books that told familiar events with unfamiliar outcomes, wars ending differently, leaders who rose and fell in reversed order. Some called these errors, others called them revelations, proof that the archive was not an accident, but a glimpse into what had been overwritten. Daily life became a negotiation with uncertainty. People lived with doubles, some friendly, some hostile. A man in Bozeman swore he now shared a house with his own older self, both refusing to leave. A child asked why his mother no longer recognized his drawings because in this version of her life, she had never taught him how to hold a pencil. These were not isolated glitches. They were the fabric of existence unraveling and restitching itself in front of everyone's eyes. Most disturbing of all was the sky. Though the scar had closed, a faint seam remained, visible only on the clearest nights. Stars near it shimmered as if reflected in water, doubling and bending in ways no telescope could explain. Astronomers warned that constellations were shifting. Others feared something worse, that what they saw was not their own sky, but another pressing close against it. As weeks passed, the valley became a place of pilgrimage. Some came seeking lost loved ones, hoping another reset would bring them back. Others came to escape, convinced they could step into another life where their mistakes had not been made. The valley became both shrine and trap, its spirals glowing faintly under the soil, its silence a promise that it was not finished. And then came the dreams. Survivors across the world reported the same visions: gears turning beneath mountains, endless spirals winding tighter and tighter, and a voice whispering that this was only one cycle among many. People awoke, drenched in sweat, unsure if the dreams were personal or broadcast from the machine itself. Historians tried to make sense of it. Theories flourished that the oldest machine had been triggered, that the array had been a catalyst, that humanity had merely stumbled into a mechanism older than civilization. Others argued it was not a machine at all, but a process, a cosmic reset meant to purge and begin again. But no one could deny the truth felt in their bones. This was not the end. It was only the descent into another turning, another cycle. And if time itself was a wheel, then the valley was its hub, and all of humanity was being drawn into its rotation. In the end, silence returned. But silence is never permanent. Beneath the Montana soil, the ticking remained faint but steady, waiting for the next reset. And the world, changed and uncertain, held its breath, knowing that when the circle turned again, there might be no distinction between past, present, and future, only descent. Time has always been humanity's anchor. We mark our days with calendars, measure our hours with clocks, and tell our stories in the certainty of beginnings, middles, and ends. But what happens when that anchor drifts? What happens when time itself bends, fractures, and turns back upon us? The story of the Montana Valley is not just a local tale of strange loops or vanishing towns. It has become something larger, an echo that stretches across continents, infecting skies, seas, and archives. Families wake to lives they don't remember. Cities slip into days that don't belong to them. Records emerge from histories that never happened. And beneath it all lies the possibility that none of this is accidental, that the land itself is a mechanism, a machine older than civilization, designed not to tell time, but to turn it. If that is true, then we are no longer simply witnesses. We are participants in a process we cannot control. The last reset showed us that time can fold, overlap, and rebuild itself in ways we do not yet understand. And though the world now appears quiet, though the scars in the sky have closed and the towers have gone silent, the ticking remains. Beneath the soil, beneath memory, beneath everything we call reality, something waits to turn again. Perhaps the question is not whether we can stop it, but whether we were ever meant to. Were we always caught inside this wheel? Are our lives, our choices, our histories nothing more than repetitions, shadows of cycles long forgotten? And if so, how many times have we descended before? What chills us most is not the possibility of another reset, but the realization that we may not recognize it when it comes. We may already be living in a cycle, convinced it is new, when in truth we are only walking a path worn smooth by countless lives before ours. Every echo, every duplicate, every impossible photograph may not be a mistake, but a reminder, evidence that we have been here before and we will be here again. The valley keeps its secrets. The archive grows thicker with each passing year, and the oldest machine hums quietly, winding tighter, preparing for the next turn. Whether we call it a malfunction, a contagion, or a design, the truth is unavoidable. Time does not belong to us. It never has. As you leave this story tonight, ask yourself, when you wake tomorrow, will it be the same tomorrow you expected? Or will it be another loop, another shift, another descent into a history rewritten before your eyes? And if you found proof, photographs of a life you never lived, documents from a future not yet written, would you want to know, or would you look away, content to forget until the circle turns again? Some mysteries demand answers. Others, like this one, demand only that we listen to the ticking and prepare for what comes next. Because whether in Montana or in your own hometown, time may already be bending. And when it resets again, there may be no difference between yesterday, today, and forever. This has been one of history's most unsettling stories. If you want to keep traveling deeper into mysteries like this, real events, hidden records, and questions that defy reason, make sure you join us, subscribe to the channel, Share this with someone who loves unraveling strange truths, and stay with us as we continue to explore the places where history and the unexplained collide. Because in the end, the loops are not just happening in Montana, they're happening everywhere, and the next reset could begin with you.